We are really excited to be with you virtually for this event. We believe that online can be amazing. It's true that we haven't figured out a way to replace a good hug or to hand out cookies, but we have experienced rich engagement and learning in virtual spaces. And it is the experience Francois and I and the rest of our team are offering to all of you in the Open Space Café next week. One piece we are excited about is the ease with which we can bring a variety of resources from different parts of the world, including Francois Nukel and his extensive experience with Open Space coming to us from London. Francois, I'm so glad to be working on this project with you.
Well, I'm glad to be here, and I'm especially glad to be presenting here, not as myself, but with a great team as a collaborative effort. So it's really great to be here on Zoom with you, Karen.
Collaboration is so important, especially now. We are living in strange times, faced with the kinds of challenges that require our very best thinking and learning. In this video, we're going to explore the reasons we believe that dialogue is an essential tool for that learning. We're also going to explain a bit about the online tools we'll be using and how you can learn more about them. But first, I want to say this is going to be fun.
Indeed. And the reason it's going to be fun is because open space really connects people to their interests and the things they're passionate about. And when people are given the chance to talk about the things they're passionate about, as well as hear the passions of others, that's when things really become fun.
One of the core beliefs of open space is that the group that is gathered, that is to say all of you, are exactly the right people for that conversation. We believe that the knowledge, ideas, lived experience each of you bring is valuable, and that as you share it, discuss it, and play with it, what arrives is in that shared space will go far beyond the contribution of any one. Francois, you've been an open space facilitator for 20 years. What can you tell us about why we are using the open space structure for this event?
Well, mainly because it's one of the few ways that enables a large number of people to come together and have conversations with one another about issues that really matter to them. So Harrison Owen, the creator of Open Space, put it this way. He used to be a conference planner and designer. And after each conference, people would come up to him saying how much they'd enjoyed the conference. But the absolute best part were the coffee breaks, because that's when they were able to meet new people and have meaningful conversations. And they wanted more of that. So Harrison thought, well, if the best part of the conferences are always the coffee breaks, why not make the whole conference a coffee break? And essentially, that's what open space is, a long, continuous coffee break.
That's a great story.
Another reason we're using open space is because it reflects a new paradigm. We're in unusual times at the moment, experiencing a shift from a mechanistic, clockwork view of the world to a more living system which values connectivity and relationships. But this is not new. Even in the past, there have been people advocating a more organic systems point of view. So Mary Parker Follett, for instance, a management thinker who was a contemporary of the people who invented management as we know it today, argued for a more fluid approach. In 1919, she wrote an article called Community is a Process, in which she argued that people are constantly interacting and influencing each other dynamically and interdependently. In other words, we're not little islands unto ourselves, but rather the dynamism creates entities which are more than the sum of the people and are constantly evolving. Community is a process where we're all constantly learning, rewiring our brains based on our interactions. She was way ahead of her time. What she described there in different words is what we might refer to today as organic living ecosystem. Being a woman, she was largely ignored at the time.
That is such a pity. I can imagine a very different world today if people had listened to her.
Indeed. But throughout the 20th century, there coexisted two scientific theories which were incompatible with each other. Both could not be true at the same time. This was Einstein's relativity theory and Heisenberg and Planck's quantum theory. One thing that scientists learned is that the act of observing and measuring a phenomenon actually changes the outcome. In other words, the observer and the observed are inseparably linked. We're all interdependent, whether we like it or not. One scientist who just couldn't accept the incompatibility of these two theories, however, was David Bohm. And he spent a lifetime trying to reconcile the two theories, talking of hidden variables and implicate order. In the process, he discovered he couldn't find the implicate order simply through scientific means, but rather had to go outside of science. He found he could access the incompatibilities through dialogue, because dialogue is what creates reality, the outcome of an observation. So dialogue became a key scientific tool of discovery and learning. So the fundamental conclusion of his research is that we're all co-creators of our reality, not individually, that would be called imagination, but collectively. And because we're all interlinked and interdependent, each one of us plays a role in this co-creative process. This is a message which has yet to find its way to the general population. So those familiar with Otto Scharmer's U theory, for instance, will understand this. Scharmer's work is largely based on Bohm's principles. Essentially, we're all co-creators of reality through dialogue.
I can see why you use this to introduce open space. It's all about being in dialogue.
Precisely. And this is why open space also reflects the new paradigm. I believe there's a shift taking place from discussion and debate towards dialogue and conversation. So debate and discussion essentially reflect our mode of thinking in the past century. Indeed, you will find most education programs are based on discussion and debate. Discussion and debate are anchored in individualism, reflecting the Newtonian notion that the observer is separate from the observed and can master nature and win. In this view, life is more like a competition, reflected in the notion of the survival of the fittest, and where winning the argument is valued. Indeed, the aim is to beat all adversaries. This is fundamentally an either-or way of thinking. We find this in government with the system of opposition. The fundamental aim of political parties is to beat other political parties in elections. You find this in thinking in law, in our adversarial system. Just think of court cases which are labeled A versus B or Kramer versus Kramer. And in business, the best argument wins. So in practice, this really means the loudest one wins. Indeed, MBA graduates at the Harvard Business Schools used to be evaluated based on their ability to win the debate in a hall of 100 or so students, leaving the introverts, who often have the best ideas, at a severe disadvantage. I don't know if this is still the current practice or not, though.
Hopefully, they're updating their practices, but there is an awful lot of updating to do. I can really see how much our world spends its energy on debate and oppositional speech.
Yes, indeed. So the other side, whereas I think what is really needed for the 21st century, and which Bohm and Sharma and many others are pointing to, is dialogue and conversation. Dialogue and conversation are based on authentic interactions of people where both observer and observed switch roles and co-create together. Dialogue and conversation are much more focused on integrating multiple perspectives. They reconcile and transcend, and in evolutionary terms are much more symbiotic in nature. So dialogue and conversations are based on both and thinking, where the outcome is not winning, but a more collaborative and generative emergence. A key factor is that any outcome cannot be predicted or planned, so one cannot predetermine who needs to be in a room, so to speak. Indeed, dialogue that excludes certain perspectives automatically distorts reality. On the contrary, what dialogue calls for is the inclusion of all diverse perspectives.
It's amazing to think how different the world would be if we could shift this mindset and turn our focus to dialogue.
Indeed, and that's largely what Mary Parker Follett was essentially talking about. Inclusivity is not just a moral imperative, it's also essentially a real one based on science if humanity is to survive and prosper. Contextualized and embodied are key characteristics of dialogue and conversation, as are inclusivity and rich interactivity. Dialogue and conversations are anchored in both and thinking and the co-creative integration of multiple perspectives. This is also reflected in the true meanings of the words themselves. Discussion, the word discussion comes from the Latin and means to dash to pieces or to investigate by striking apart. And debate comes from the old French word battre, which meant to combat, to argue, to fight, to beat, and indeed the English word battle is derived from the old French word. So in both cases, the language reflects war, violence, and the beating of adversaries. And on the other side, conversation comes from the Latin con and versare. Con meaning together, and versare meaning to turn. And conversare meant in Latin to dance, because we're turning together. And sometimes also to change, like changing directions together. And this is where we have the English word convert. And dialogue has a Greek origin. Dia means through, and logos means word or meaning. And dialogue meant a flow of meaning reflecting its emergent properties. And I like the idea of us dancing in flow around an idea, creating meaning and creating our reality.
That is just fascinating, what the language shows us about how we engage. It really points to the way education can embody a worldview. To explore that further, we'd like to introduce you to another of our team members, Lorraine Golden, who has interviewed an expert on dialogue in education.
Yes, she interviewed Pascal Monpoint-Gaillard, who is a social psychologist, trainer, and researcher in education, and who works in France as an expert for UNESCO, the European Commission, and the Council of Europe, and is also the president of Learn to Change, Change to Learn. I think she largely reflects or says something similar to what I'm saying, but in a more grounded in an educational context. Let's hear some extracts from that interview.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lorraine Golden, and today I am talking with Pascal Monpoint-Gaillard to explore the importance of conversation and dialogue in education. Pascal, we are honored to have you with us today. And so would you start us off by explaining how does conversation and dialogue support professional development of educators?
Thank you so much, Lorraine, for your introduction. I'm very happy to be here, to be able to give a message about conversation and its importance for learning and for education. And very happy also to be able to do this in a non-formal setting with people working with early childhood, because these years of our education are so extremely important that I feel honored to be asked to do this. So you're asking me how conversation and dialogue support professional development of educators. And I think in order for me to give the essence of why I think it's so important and what I learned with doing these conversations is that you can distinguish the usual continued professional development of educators and something that would be more engaging in terms of thinking about purpose of education. Why am I an educator, and what am I trying to do with the kids when I'm being an educator with them? And this is why I like Fullan and Hargreaves' definition of professional learning and development. They kind of make the difference between the traditional type of training or education for educators, which is sometimes quite technical, where you're learning ways of doing things, methods, etc. And professional development, that would be something more than this professional learning, where you're really engaging with your values and with purposeful action in the social field. So I really like this notion of professional learning and development. And to get to this development, conversation is extremely important. When the teachers are in conversation, they're really able to start thinking about their own values and whether or not they are living these values. So these values become lived values. And also trying to see if they're not living contradictions. Being a living contradiction is when I hold values dear to me, but in my practice, I'm not able, for many reasons. It could be systems reasons, it could be institutional, it could be what's happening in my own life, etc. Many reasons that sometimes we can't live our values. Also, coming into conversation makes a kind of more level playing field, where if everyone can participate, the locus of power is changed versus when you're having a training and there's a trainer or an expert giving you information. It's very top-down-ish. And when you're actually learning through conversation, there are no experts. Actually, the knowledge is being built within the conversation with peers. That's a very important aspect. So in terms of conversations for professional development, Learn to Change is quite engaged in doing this. We're bringing further what we were doing in the Pestalozzi program with the Council of Europe. And we have different types of teacher conversations that we're inviting teachers into. We have something called the Conversation Series, which is where we meet people and we have a one-on-one conversation. We just film it. It becomes a podcast that teachers can look at. But we have something that I feel very, very close to. When the COVID pandemic started, we were able to react within the first week of the school closures, and we started something that we called learning meetings. And these learning meetings are not your usual webinar, because it's actually we're inviting educators to talk and share their stories from the field. And from there, we have processes, cooperative structures that we can take the learning, what did we learn from this, and put it out there in different resources. And also in the Pestalozzi program, we were very keen on things like open space. We had, for example, summer school, and a whole day was devoted to this open space. The first day, actually, we started with a party, and then we did open space. And Socratic walks is also another conversational type of professional development that we found very powerful, where any participant can say, I have this or that problem, or this or this question is coming to me, and invites 3 or 4 people to walk. And during this walk, we're doing a Socratic method of questioning and looking at assumptions and what do these assumptions mean, etc. So conversation has many ways of happening, but they're all so rich and useful.
That's exciting. So how do educators learn through talking?
That's a big question. I have a 300-page answer to that with my PhD, but I'm going to try to get some nuggets here for us to see. And in order to do this, I would like to show a visual. And we're going to use this visual to kind of get into this topic. So what we're interested in is types of conversation that are generative, which is something that Otto Scharmer, for example, in Theory Review talks about a lot. And generative conversations allow you to go into different type of thinking than the type of thinking and talking that we can do, that we're mostly engaged in our everyday lives. So looking at this visual here, I'm looking at the different aspects of conversation and trying to make a difference between different types. So you have, first we're talking. Conversation can be done also through writing. Whether it's talking or writing, we consider what we say as utterances. So this is, Bakhtin used this a lot, and I think Habermas too. They're specialists in communication. So we say something, then this thing that we say exists within a relationship with others. So you have types of talk where there's no interaction. Here on the right, you see if I am speaking, it's a speech, a monologue, a lecture. So there is no interaction. This is not what I'm interested in here, talking about conversation for learning. Now, let's assume there is interaction. You can have different conversations, interactions that are process-oriented or really just more attention to outcome. And this is extremely important because if you look at forms of discussion and debate, here we're really into something that is paying attention to outcome. Normally these debates can be very competitive, argumentative, we're engaging in right-wrong talk. We're in an either-or mindset. We're not seeing oftentimes the whole, we're looking at parts in order to be able to win an argument. We're justifying, defending, and selling. So for me also, this is not generative talk. I know a lot of teachers use debate and think it's a good education for democracy method. I personally don't feel that these debates are very, don't generate deep thinking. So if we're looking at types of talking that are more process-oriented, some are light, like chatting or friendly connections, etc. But since we're interested in learning and why conversation is important for educators, we're going to look at the high level of meaning-making activity within a conversation. And this is what we call conversation and dialogue. And it's very important to have these different terms. And then when you're living and talking with people, you can kind of think, oh, I'm in this type of talk or I'm in this type of talk. And in conversation and dialogue, we're here very often in a non-formal, very spontaneous interaction. It's collaborative, it's respectful. And if we are focusing on meaning making, it's important to see, for example, how are we dealing with divergence? So you see here the word congeniality. And congeniality is actually how we're dealing with convergence and divergence, and a high level of acceptance of divergence without it being a problem in the relationship is high congeniality. And this is really a skill that's so important for engaging people in social justice, in activism, etc. I'm reading a book right now that's called Joyful Militancy. And that's really it. It's exactly that. How can we call in instead of calling out all the time? And these conversations are very systemic. You can see the whole, not just the parts. There are connections between the parts. And it allows you to start thinking about what you're thinking. So looking at inquiring into your own assumptions, being curious about what others think. And really, these for me are the conditions of a fruitful conversation for learning. So the experience of dialogue is really shifting from either or to both and, to more systemic ways of talking about things, and bringing in our stories, because we're living human beings, and the reasons for which we come into communication for meaningful dialogue is to be able to share our experiences. Experiences of dialogue are very rich when every person participating can be real, express their realness and not pretend. And in online conversation, it can be a little bit more difficult because some people are shy, some people are not sure that they can convey what they're trying to convey in online settings. So it's very important that the facilitator be there to really express this realness and invite the realness in the people who are speaking. And conversations are alive. So you know how you can start a conversation, but you never know where it's going to go. The journey is making itself along the way. So they're full of surprises. And it takes a lot of adaptation to be able to continue a conversation and learn from it and make meanings with others. So this is a very important skill for an educator. And the last thing I'd like to say is, in order to be able to participate well in such a conversation, it is good to think about your own state of preparation, your inner condition. Are you in a state where you are able to do all these things, seeing the whole and not the parts, listening to others, etc.? So there's some work to be done, as we were saying, be the change you want to see. So there's work to be done inside yourself. And here I would just like to show a few of our cards for democracy, which is a tool that Learn to Change has developed to help people with this inner preparedness, these inner conditions. So I will show a few of these cards to you.
This would be great to see the tool, Pascal. And I think this goes right along with, you were going to share some tips for how we have meaningful conversations in online environments. So looking forward to this.
Yes, I thought it would be important to give tips because we're preparing for an open space and people will be offering topics for discussions, things that they hold in their heart. And so it can be good when you're inviting people into a conversation to have a few ideas on what you can do to help people engage better. So let's see a few tips for open, meaning-making conversations. The study that I am about to finish now has shown the structural importance of emotional well-being for the people who participate in conversations so that they're ready to engage. And engagement is really one of the central goals that we have here. People, to increase this engagement, there are a few things that we can do to help that. And it's important because the level of interest and motivation and engagement that we have are often proportional. And so it means that with developed interest, there's increased motivation and more effective engagement. So they go together. It's really a cycle. There is a dialogue really going on, and it's dialogue. It's not a series of monologues, and where people are still cohesively engaging in meaning making together. All these things are quite challenging, and so this is where the inner psychological preparedness comes in as important, and the cards for democracy that I was talking about. So if you're doing all these things, and if you're able also to scaffold from what the people are saying, so if they have narratives, if they're talking their stories, what happened to them, etc., then this is very important to draw on to bring the conversation together. So inviting and scaffolding is very important. That's in that sense. And also, if you're going to engage with values, this will really help in what Argyris called double loop learning. So we have this usual cycle of I do, I experience, I evaluate, I learn, and I do again in this kind of cycle. If you're adding in that cycle, I have my values and I'm doing, and in what I did, I have my values and this is what I learned. The cycle becomes like a double loop where you're adding the ethical and value part to it. And the cards for democracy really invite you to do that. We use them a lot in our conversations. So here is a face-to-face event where people are using the cards. I chose a few that I thought would be important for open space. And I chose 5 cards just to give examples. And if I look at these cards, I think these components of competence, that's what we call them. They are parts, if I can experience them in a situation, I'm showing that I can do these things. So for example, I make efforts to improve my listening skills. You can always improve your listening skills. And you can also look at how you're doing with that within a conversation. So this is an invitation, for example. You can take that card and observe yourself in a situation and kind of see, oh, this is where I am, but this is where I would like to be. So in order to get there, I can do this or that. And the one I prefer here of all the 5 that are here is I ask questions more than I give answers. And we're again in this generative idea. If you're giving answers all the time, then you're probably not engaging enough with questions. And in order to learn, you have to engage with questions. It is better to do it that way. The very last thing I would say is that conversation is not our usual way of thinking that we learn. And so it's also important to get into a mode where you're aware of what you're learning and helping others be aware of what they're learning. So recognition of what I and others regard as learning is important for conversation.
Pascal, this was such a rich little dive. Like, I know your work is so expansive, but it was a really rich dive into a very expansive work that like brings us great stuff as we enter into this open space. So thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us today.
Thank you so much, Lorene. It was a pleasure. And I hope this whole event will be a very, very big success.
Thank you.
So much great information there. Wow. Looking back to what she said, I noticed a similarity between Pascal's diagram about the types of communication and your slide earlier. On the right side, she has monologues or lectures where there is no or very little interaction. And to the left, she has chat where there is very little meaning making and thus little potential for learning. The 2 strands in the middle, though, are the ones that looked a lot like yours, the discussion and debate to the right and the conversation and dialogue on the left.
Indeed, yes. Her descriptions for the 2 types were very similar, and interestingly, the overarching distinction between the 2 in her case that she placed was whether they were more focused on outcome or on process. So the focus on outcome leads to the discussion debate type of learning, where the results are predictable. And this is the predominant mode of our traditional education system and our way of operating in life. And it's reflected in the general testing culture we have. Whereas the conversation dialogue type of learning has no predictable outcome. It's what Pascal called generative and alive, and what we could possibly call emergent. And of course, that's precisely the kind of learning that our current world of VUCA, a world of climate crisis and COVID-19, a world of complexity, is crying out for.
I want to come back to VUCA in a few minutes, but first, what else comes up for you as you watch Lorene's interview with Pascal?
Well, a number of things, but her final comment I think is important, and that is that we generally don't recognize what we are learning when we're in dialogue. We're often not aware that we're learning. I suspect because we don't generally view dialogue as a learning opportunity, and also due to how we view what learning is. And yet I can say most probably the most important things I've ever learned in life have been through dialogue. Dialogue shapes our perception and helps us shift our perspective. Nowadays, we know about the plasticity of the brain from neuroscience. That is, our brain is not an empty vessel that needs to be filled with education. Rather, our brain is constantly rewiring itself according to our relationships in the world and our dialogue. In other words, dialogue changes our worldview, and we need to learn to recognize that. I have 2 practices which may be useful in this respect. One is a Japanese practice of hansei, which is basically reflection or collective reflection. For example, in closing rounds of meetings, we could not only ask what could be improved, but we could pose the question, what have we learned today? And the practice of journalism, which is really another way of personal reflecting internally, writing down what came up for me, and especially what did I learn?
Reflection is so powerful. I love that. I think one of the things reflection helps us do is think about things from different perspectives. So often we get caught in the either or thinking we grew up with. Pausing for reflection gives us time to think about broader options with more of a both end approach.
Yes, and let me give you an example of the shift from either or to both ands thinking. I'll share my slides again. In the current COVID-19 situation, one of the main debates being had at the moment is whether we should focus on our health at the cost of the economy or stimulate the economy at the cost of our health. The debate is health versus economy, which is fundamentally an either-or question. And so our politicians are dutifully doing what they were taught at school, weighing the pros and cons of either side of the argument in order to come to some sort of decision. What I'm suggesting, as are many others, is that we don't treat this as an either-or issue, but as a both-and issue by reframing the question. So instead of asking, should we do this or that, ask, what can we do to this that also benefits that? So in this case, how can we stimulate the economy as well as improve health? Or what health measures can we put in place which also improve the economy? If we ask either or questions, we're sort of stuck with limited choices. But just by asking the questions differently, suddenly we stimulate our creativity and are able to find better solutions. Indeed, there are quite a few examples of companies who've done exactly that in this situation and who are contributing positive to the situation as well as thriving financially.
That is also a great example of VUCA, which you mentioned a bit ago. VUCA is shorthand for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, which is exactly what we're facing with COVID. I think we're seeing more and more that we're living in a VUCA world. What does that suggest about the skills we need moving forward?
Yes, so is what I call the VUCA skills in particular. In other words, these are the kind of skills that we need to be able to work and thrive in a VUCA world. Some wonderful work has been done by Theo Dawson called the Lexica Scale, which is all about different skills we as adults need to have to be able to live with VUCA. We can see an overview of the skills in this slide, and you can get a bit of a sense of it, but what it boils down to are the sub-skills which all help us to integrate, and integration is crucial to be able to do both and thinking. The thing about these skills is that they cannot be learnt by rote, and they cannot be learned from a book, but they have to be learnt by continuous practice and reflection, and dialogue is a friend of reflection. So more importantly, these skills cannot be learned by oneself either. They have to be learned together with peers. So peer learning is fundamental. So we're talking about integration skills learned collaboratively among peers in communities of practice while focusing on the diversity of perspectives. And without diversity, there is no learning. Equity is central.
That's a big change in how we think about education, especially with schools having to be online right now.
It certainly is. But the other research I'd briefly like to touch on is the work of Mary Bean, focusing on leadership in complexity. So complexity is completely different from complicatedness. But unfortunately, we tend to treat complex problems as if they were complicated. Mary uses a jumbo jet to explain complicated. A jet has thousands of parts, but there's a clear causal connection between the related parts so that an expert, an engineer in this case, understands how it all works. The key is that the parts do not influence each other. So when I press the brakes, I don't get the engines suddenly revving up. In complexity, however, the parts do influence each other. So Mary defines complexity as rich interactivity and cites mayonnaise as complex. in that the egg and oil atoms influence and change each other to form something new and irreversible. The weather is another complex system, as is parenthood. There are no levers to fix the weather, for instance, nor to fix a child for that matter. And yet, that is often what we try to do. We try to fix complexity by pushing levers. Mary says what is actually required is to bring in more complexity and meet complexity with complexity by bringing in more diversity, more perspectives, and let emergence do the work through deep dialogue. So importantly, these must be dialogues across borders, not in silos.
And that is why open space is so beautiful, because bringing in complexity is precisely what it allows us to do. It brings in serendipity, invites multiple perspectives, and fosters cross-pollination of ideas, all of which cannot happen without diversity. Equity and diversity are essential.
Exactly. So, well, what is open space then, or open space technology, to give it its full name and not to confuse the architects and interior designers of this world? Well, basically, open space is a social technology or a social approach which allows a large number of participants to have deep conversations and dialogue about issues that concern them or they're passionate about. And some of the key elements of this is that these are your conversations. They're not conversations given to you by somebody else. These are your conversations. Another important feature is that everyone is invited to join. And because they are invitations, you can either decline or accept. And if you do opt in, then you take responsibility for your own learning. But everyone who accepts and participates, really everyone's voice matters. And it's a co-creative process. We're co-creating our reality. And one final warning we give to all our participants, well, be prepared to be surprised.
So I imagine our audience is wondering how all of this works. I'll be describing it in detail as we get started next week, and I promise you'll have all the support you need to do this well. For now, we want to give you a taste of what it will be like. Francois, I know you brought a short video to share.
Yes, this is an example of a live person situation, open space event. It is just to give you a flair of what open space looks like in person. And then we'll show a bit about how we'll make it happen, this all happen online.
Thanks for bringing that, Francois. It reminds me how much I've loved the open space gatherings I've attended. The thing that will be different, of course, is that now we'll be doing it online. So instead of walking from one physical space to another, We'll be navigating from one room to another on a screen. Francois has set up a platform to allow us to have all the essential elements of open space from the convenience of our own offices or kitchen tables.
Yes, we'll be using a platform called KikoChat, the components of which may be more familiar to some of you than it sounds. KikoChat uses a combination of Zoom rooms and Google Docs.
Let's give them a quick tour. Francois, why don't you show us your screen and navigate us through while I explain the bits? So when you come to Open Space Café, you'll land in our lobby, much like the lobby at an in-person conference. Here you will sign in, so the system recognizes you. Francois has already signed in, so the green button says, participate now. So you press the green button to get to the main room. Here in the main room, there are 4 key components. At the top left is a green button inviting you to join the video call. When you press this, it will open up a Zoom room where you can be with everyone else who's in the room. On the right, representing the bulk of the page, you have a document of some sort, normally a note-taking document, though in the main room, it has information and navigational instructions. At the very top of the document on the right, there may be some tabs. We can have multiple documents in a room. Here in the main room, for instance, you'll see quite a few tabs, and if you click on one, the agenda for day 1, for example, it will open the different document, a spreadsheet in this instance. This is where we'll create our agenda together. And on the left, further down, you'll have all the breakout rooms, and this is where all the various sessions and dialogues will take place based on the agenda we've set up together. Throughout Open Space, you will choose where you want to be. Let's say you are interested in the session in room 2. You click room 2 here, as Francois is showing us, and after a few seconds, it takes you to room 2. And here you see the same structure, but the Zoom button at the top left is now specifically for room 2. There are different shared documents on the right in each room, normally as here for note-taking. This is a live simultaneous document, and this gives us a first taste of equity in open space. Rather than one person taking notes for all, as we saw the reporters do in the video, this document is a live Google Doc where everyone can take notes together collaboratively. And this is one of the advantages of working online. And you have access to all the other rooms here on the left. At any point, you can move rooms. Scroll down to access the other rooms, and you'll also see who is in the rooms through each person's icon. We want to emphasize that you are free to move from one dialogue to another. You never have to feel stuck somewhere you don't want to be, and this is crucial. You cannot be passionate about something if you feel stuck where you don't want to be. Open space is all about opting in to your passion. Well, that's essentially it. So to recap, dialogue will be foundational to emergent learning for our future, not only within the circles we work with, but beyond our usual borders. It is key that everyone is invited and feels welcomed, and open space is a format that allows that to happen at scale.
Yes, exactly. So let me summarize the key points we try to convey, all pointing to equity and engagement. We emphasize the value of dialogue across borders, both for learning and for co-creating new solutions. We stress the importance of bringing your own issues rather than relying on teachers and leaders. And we pointed to the necessity of integrating different perspectives rather than combating adversarially, and the need for us to learn the skills to be able to do this.
Thanks everyone for joining us today. We hope we've given you a sense of what you will experience in the Open Space Café. We're looking forward to seeing you there.